Hello and welcome to the last part of depression as we tackle psychological stuff. And for us, this is our last video that we are ever recording for psychology because we've done it in a really awkward order.
So sad.
Yeah, it is. But do tweet me at Carne and Sarah if you could find her Twitter address, which I don't think anyone knows. So tweet me and tell me how your exam goes because I really enjoy chatting to you little
And if you don't have Twitter,
chinwags.
just write in the comments.
We love it. See?
Yeah.
She's branching out. Right. Let's get going straight away with cognitive. And it's Beck's cognitive theory, which has three aspects.
Beck proposed that depression is the result of negative thinking and catastrophizing.
The three components to depression are called the cognitive triad.
Negative views of self, thinking you're worthless.
Negative views of the world, thinking it's full of obstacles.
And negative views of the future, thinking it will continue in the same way.
These interfere with normal cognitive processing, leading to impairments in perception, memory and problem solving, and lead to a person becoming obsessed with negative thoughts.
And importantly, these thoughts become automatic.
Yes.
Beck believed that depression-prone individuals develop a negative self-schema.
Where a schema is, in this case, a set of beliefs and expectations about themselves that are negative.
Beck claimed that these are acquired in childhood due to traumatic experiences like death of a parent or parental rejection or criticism.
We interpret new information in the light of our existing schema, and once we have a negative self-schema, it is difficult to interpret new information about ourselves in a positive way.
People with negative self-schemas become prone to making logical errors in their thinking and tend to focus selectively on certain aspects of a situation, ignoring equally relevant information.
He called these cognitive distortions, these errors, and hopefully you should recognise them from last year.
Overgeneralization, where a person arrives at a sweeping conclusion based on a single and trivial event.
Like us thinking this video is rubbish because one person gives it a thumbs down. It implies that if one does poorly on one thing, you assume failure in all related things.
Magnification of difficulties and failures, and minimization of success, and which is very self-explanatory.
And arbitrary inference, where people arrive at a conclusion about themselves based on insufficient or irrelevant evidence.
For example, thinking that someone doesn't like you because they haven't spoken to you in a while, even though you don't really speak anyway.
Black and white thinking, where everything is seen in a polarised manner, so even a slight waver from perfection is considered a failure.
And personalisation, where you attribute negative feelings of others to yourself, like assuming because your teacher looks cross when entering a room, it must be due to you.
Supporting evidence comes from a study comparing depressed patients with non-depressed on a Stroop task.
The non-depressed patients had been made sad by recalling unhappy memories and listening to sad music.
The depressed group, but not the sad group, paid significantly more attention to the unhappy words on the Stroop task.
This phenomenon, where depressed people pay more attention to unhappy stimuli, is called negative attentional bias, and it supports the idea that depressed patients do have faulty information processing.
But the study has the issue of bidirectional ambiguity as the data is correlational, so we cannot determine cause and effect.
Some argue that negative thinking is an effect of depression rather than the cause.
One way to assess whether the thinking is the cause of the effect is to establish if it arises before depression.
One study assessed cognitive vulnerability in 65 non-depressed women and in the third part of their pregnancy.
They found that those with high levels of cognitive vulnerability were more likely to suffer postnatal depression.
This suggests that the faulty thinking does come from before onset of depression, therefore supporting Beck.
But some research suggests that negative thinking is not specific of depression, occurring with all anxiety disorders as well.
This suggests that cognitive vulnerability is no more specific to mood disorders than genetic vulnerability.
And in fact, normal people without depression have also been found to show cognitive distortion.
The main criticism is that some irrational beliefs are actually more accurate than those of most people, a phenomena known as depressive realism or the sadder but wiser effect.
So depressive people give more accurate estimates of the likelihood of disaster than controls.
It is reductionist, focusing too much on the individual and not on the events in the environment, which may influence depression.
And finally, strength is the implications for treatment.
The cognitive model has given rise to CBT, which aims to challenge and neutralise them through techniques like cognitive restructuring.
The second and much smaller explanation we're going to use is psychodynamic explanation.
You can use the helplessness theory, but As this one follows the model you've already learned, we're going to stick with the psychodynamic and our dear friend Freud.
He argued that depression is like grief, in that it occurs as a reaction to the loss of an important relationship.
He suggests that the individual identifies with the lost person so that the repressed anger towards the lost person is directed inwards towards the self.
This inner-directed anger reduces the person's self-esteem and makes them vulnerable to depression.
Freud did distinguish between actual losses, like of a relative, and symbolic losses, like a job.
Both types can produce depression by causing the individual to re-experience childhood episodes where they experience loss of affection from a significant person like a parent.
Support from this comes from a study assessing depression in a mixed group of 300 psychiatric patients.
They found that 27% of those who were highly depressed had lost a parent before the age of 16.
And a similar loss had occurred for only 12% of those who were not significantly depressed.
Another study using rhesus monkeys observed the effects of separating the infant from a mother.
Both exhibited symptoms similar to depression in humans.
However, this is an animal study, and it's not clear whether the humans suffer depression.
Another study studied 250 women who had lost their mothers through separation or death before they were 17. They found that the loss of their mother doubles the risk of anxiety and depressive disorders. The rate of depression is as particularly high amongst those mothers who had died before the age of 6.
But another study found that although 29 out of 32 women who became depressed had experienced a severe event, 78% of those who did experience a severe event did not become depressed, meaning that the evidence is not totally convincing.
And it's difficult to test Freud's theory as we can't observe the unconscious motives, making it unfalsifiable.
There is some evidence that people with depression do experience more anger than non-depressed people, but there is no evidence that the anger is directed inwards. Instead, researchers suggested that the hostility is directed to those close to them.
On to the first psychological treatment, REBT, or Rational Emotive Behavioural Therapy.
It's a form of CBT, a cognitive behavioural therapy developed by Ellis.
It's based on the idea that problems are a result of irrational thinking.
Individuals frequently develop self-defeating habits because of faulty beliefs about themselves and the world around them.
REBT helps clients to understand this irrationality and the consequences of thinking this way, helping them to substitute more effective problem-solving methods.
So it's based on the idea of cognitive restructuring using a dispute system.
The idea is if patients can develop a dispute system to challenge their beliefs, they will no longer suffer emotional problems.
For example, they may assume that they receive no social invitations because no one likes them, when more likely is that they're often busy or don't issue such invitations themselves.
There are 3 types of disputing that they are encouraged to do.
Logical, whether what they are thinking makes any sense.
Empirical, whether there is any evidence or proof.
And pragmatic, whether the belief is at all helpful.
Effective disputing can challenge an individual's beliefs from catastrophizing to more rational interpretations, helping them feel better and becoming more self-accepting.
REBT is directive in the sense that a therapist is active and directive to a greater degree than other cognitive therapies. Clients get homework where they have to consider to what extent their beliefs are rational.
The AO2 of this is split into 2 parts, effectiveness and appropriateness.
So beginning with effectiveness, and according to Ellis, it's 90% successful, taking an average of 27 sessions to complete treatment.
But, as it's Ellis himself, there may be bias as he is assessing his own therapy. But other researchers have shown REBT to be effective.
One meta-analysis of other therapies found REBT to have the second highest average success of 10 forms of therapy for all mental disorders.
For major depression, REBT with medication is more effective than medication alone.
The fear that the antidepressant drugs might increase suicide risk has led researchers to explore the possibility of combining antidepressants with CBT, which might reduce this.
One study used 327 adolescents between 12 and 17 diagnosed with major depression.
They were randomly assigned to either Prozac alone, CBT alone, or Prozac combined with CBT.
They found that CBT significantly reduced suicidal thoughts and behaviour.
When patients began the study, 30% expressed thoughts of suicide.
At the end of the study, this had dropped down to under 15% for those on drugs.
And 6% for those who have CBT, showing CBT is effective in reducing suicidal thoughts.
On to appropriateness and some support for REBT for putting control in the hands of the patient as they must restructure their own faulty thinking.
But this means that the patient must be willing to change their thinking, and often depressed patients lack the motivation to help themselves, and therefore the therapy may not be appropriate.
But sometimes antidepressant drugs can be used to lift the symptoms and enable the patient to participate in CBT.
Now, the main criticism is that some some irrational beliefs are in fact more accurate than those of most people.
The phenomenon is known as the sadder but wiser effect, or depressive realism.
For example, depressed people give more accurate estimates of the likelihood of disaster than controls, implying that actually defining what constitutes an irrational belief could be a problem.
But cognitive therapies are cost-effective as they don't usually involve prolonged treatment and are popular with clients who don't want to dig deep into their hidden fears, preferring to avoid psychodynamic approaches.
However, cognitive therapies have been criticised for focusing on the symptoms rather than the causes, as they don't look at what caused patients to develop faulty thoughts in the first place.
It's been argued that because it provides clients with the strategies for self-help, it's less manipulative than other treatments.
But REBT is regarded as one of the most aggressive CBTs and is in addition judgmental about the nature of a client's thought, and these aspects raise ethical concerns.
And on to our last treatment, PIT, or Psychodynamic Interpersonal Therapy.
It's developed in an attempt to move away from a traditional psychoanalytic approach of a one-sided sort of relationship between therapist and a client.
Originally, it was called the conversational model, emphasising on the fact that mutual task of the therapist and client was to engage in therapeutic conversation.
In this conversation, problems are not only talked about as past events, but also actively relived in the present and resolved within a therapeutic relationship.
The goal is to develop with the patient a mutual feeling language and a relationship of aloneness togetherness.
The model has 7 interlinking components, but you really need to know about 2 major ones.
Firstly, an exploratory rationale. Here, interpersonal difficulties in the individual's life are identified, and the therapist tries to find a rationale for the individual that links their current symptoms with these interpersonal difficulties. By the end of the first session, the therapist should be able to construct a formulation which links interpersonal difficulties to the development of emotional problems. This is shared with the patient and becomes the focus point of the rest of their therapy.
And secondly, shared understanding. Here the therapist tries to understand what the individual is really feeling. There are several strategies to encourage development of greater openness. Therapists use statements rather than questions, as questions make a therapeutic session more one-sided and may make the patient feel as if they're being put on the spot as to come up with the right answer. And all the statements are made in a tentative manner, as the negotiating style is the sort of the how, as you'll see, is crucial. Therapists may say, "This is how I see it now, but I may be wrong. I'd like you to help me see it more clearly." To which, if the patient can resist breaking out in verse of "I can see clearly now the rain has gone," they may make some progress. Now, a negotiating style produces an atmosphere of collaboration between the patient and therapist, and here a deeper understanding is reached through a series of gradual adjustments of meaning, getting closer to a patient's experience.
The AO2 is again split into effectiveness and appropriateness.
Now, one study investigated the effects of PIT in a routine clinical practice session.
62 patients received a course of PIT over a 52-month period.
Outcomes were assessed using the Beck Depression Inventory, or BDI.
There was a significant difference in scores on the BDI in the pre- and post-treatment phases.
Clinically, significant change was achieved by 34% of clients as measured by the BDI.
These results were roughly equivalent to the changes in symptoms reported by other therapies such as CBT.
Showing that PIT can be effective, there's so many abbreviations in this, showing that PIT can be effective treatment for depression in routine clinical settings like hospitals or surgeries.
The collaborative psychology project found that CBT and PIT were equally effective in reducing the severity of depression.
But after 12 months, those treated with PIT or CBT-LOL showed a tendency for symptoms to recur, thus limiting its long-term effectiveness.
PIT is, though, one of the few psychodynamic treatments that have been tested in randomised clinical trials and has evidence that it's effective.
Shared understanding is a difficult task as it is unrealistic for a therapist to really feel what the client is feeling.
As such, it is probably only ever partially achieved and so may limit the success. And finally, on to appropriateness.
It's relatively easy to learn and can be practiced by therapists from a wide range of different theoretical backgrounds.
Though preferable, therapists have background training in interpersonal therapy or dynamic therapy.
Compared to other psychodynamic treatments, PIT is relatively short and has been demonstrated to be effective within 12 weeks.
And that is it, the whole of depression, and for us, the whole of our psychology revision series. The last one we're going to record for the A-level.
It's been a pleasure helping you to revise. Do tweet me at Carne, as I'd love to hear how you're all getting on, especially those who got in touch while doing the AS. I've been Will Carne.
And I've been Sarah Carmine, and this has been our series by WAHEY Productions. Thank you for listening.
Bye.
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 And our dear friend Fraud. Freud. How'd you say his name?
Oh, that's going on the end of the
Oh no.